2 years after she left, the Duke found her with child, and realized he'd lost more than his pride. The mist rose from the moorland like forgotten breath, and the Duke of Ashford sat motionless within his carriage, watching the village of Thornwick materialize through the grey veil. 2 years. 2 years of silence stretched between that autumn when she departed and this cold winter afternoon when circumstance, or perhaps cruelty, had drawn him back to this corner of his vast holdings. He had not wished to return. The estate manager's letter had been perfunctory, repairs required, tenant grievances, a matter of inheritance concerning a parcel near the physician's cottage. Nothing to compel a man of his station, yet he had come. Perhaps duty, perhaps something darker. The whisper of curiosity he had trained himself to suppress. The carriage descended toward the village proper, and he withdrew the worn leather gloves from his coat pocket. How many times had he held them thus, feeling the softness at the fingers where wear had thinned the material? He had worn them the day she left. He had worn them every day since. The streets were narrow, lined with modest cottages. Smoke curled from chimneys. A woman in a grey shawl hurried past with a child, a small bundle against her chest, barely visible in the fading light. He paid her no particular attention. There were many such women in villages. But as the carriage rolled onward, something arrested him, a gesture, the tilt of her head, the protective curve of her arm around the child. He turned sharply, his hand pressed against the window, but the mist had already consumed her. "Stop!" he commanded, his voice sharp enough that the coachman drew the horses to an abrupt halt. The silence that followed was profound. He sat rigid, listening to the creak of the carriage settling, the distant cry of a rook, the whisper of wind through bare branches. In that quiet, his heart performed an act of rebellion. It quickened. It remembered. 2 years. She would have been here, in this village all along, living, breathing. Perhaps, the thought struck him with the force of a blow, she had not left England at all. She had simply withdrawn into a world he did not inhabit, one where he would never naturally look. The coachman did not move. He was waiting for instruction. "Whose cottage lies beyond the merchant's corner?" the Duke asked, though he already knew. His voice was steady, stripped of inflection. "The physician's residence, sir. Though Dr. Hartley passed some 18 months prior, his daughter remains, I believe." The words fell into the carriage like stones into dark water. His daughter. She had stayed. She had remained in this modest place in her father's house and had built some kind of life from the wreckage he had left behind. And the child, he could not complete the thought. To do so would be to admit something he had spent 2 years avoiding, that his pride had cost more than his reputation. It had cost a future he had never allowed himself to imagine. "Drive on," he said at last, "to the manor house." But as the carriage pulled forward through the gathering dusk, his fingers tightened upon the worn gloves. The leather had warmed beneath his palms, and for a moment, just a moment, he could almost believe that time was not a force that destroyed all things. That redemption, however unlikely, might still bloom in the cracks of his carefully constructed world. Behind them, in a cottage where lamplight had just begun to glow, a woman in a grey shawl was removing her outer garments, her movements slow and deliberate. She held a child close to her breast, and the child, with eyes that held the shape of aristocratic lineage, gazed at her with the profound innocence of one who had never known his father. The mist pressed against the windows, and neither mother nor son heard the carriage departing. Neither knew that the man they had just passed had turned to stone. The manor house stood as it had always stood, vast, formal, governed by the austere logic of inheritance and lineage. The Duke moved through its corridors, as though walking through the galleries of his own past, each room a monument to duty performed without question. He took his evening meal in solitude, the long table gleaming beneath candlelight. The servants moved like shadows, anticipating his needs before he himself recognized them. This was the machinery of aristocracy: perfect efficiency, perfect distance, perfect emptiness. After dinner, he stood before the library fireplace, and for the first time in 2 years, he allowed himself to think of her without the armor of indifference. Catherine Hartley. Even her name, in his mind, carried the weight of what he had surrendered. She had been the physician's daughter, educated, gentle, possessed of a quiet intelligence that had unsettled him far more than it should have, an attachment that could never have ended well, a transgression against his station. He had made the choice with what he believed was clarity. It had been the only honorable course. Now, in the silence of the library, surrounded by volumes bound in leather, he wondered if honor and cruelty might sometimes wear the same face. The letter had arrived before she left. He remembered composing it with the deliberation of a man issuing a death sentence. He had not gone to her. He had not permitted her a conversation that might have complicated his reasoning. He had simply written, with formal precision, that their acquaintance had become inappropriate, that he trusted she understood the obligations of his position, and that he was certain she possessed the fortitude to accept the necessity of their separation. She had left within the week. He had not asked where. Now she was here in this village, living in her father's cottage, raising a child. A child. The mathematics were brutal and unambiguous. The fire crackled. The Duke picked up the poker and stirred the dying embers, watching sparks rise like small incandescent prayers. There came a knock upon the library door. His steward entered, bearing a letter sealed with wax. "A message from the village solicitor, sir. He requests an audience regarding the matter of the disputed boundary and certain property claims filed against the physician's estate." Property claims. She had no protection then, no means of defending herself legally, at the mercy of whatever grievances enterprising neighbors might imagine. "Tell him I shall call upon him tomorrow morning," the Duke said quietly. When the steward departed, the Duke broke the seal and read the letter with the absorbing attention of a man trying to solve an equation that had no answer. The boundary dispute was minor. The property claims were unfounded, but they existed nonetheless. They were leverage. He folded the letter deliberately and placed it upon the side table. All night he did not sleep. He sat in his chambers, still wearing the worn gloves, and he confronted the architecture of his own choices. Duty had been the justification, station had been the necessity, honor had been the mask. But beneath all of it, beneath every rational argument he had constructed, there had been fear. Fear that to love her truly would diminish him. Fear that the world would judge him harmed by attachment to a woman beneath his rank. Fear that choosing love over lineage would splinter the carefully maintained structure of his identity. 2 years ago, he had believed that was strength. Now in the darkness before dawn, he began to suspect it had been cowardice. When morning came, he dressed with particular care. He selected a coat of deep charcoal, and he left off the worn gloves, placing them instead upon his writing desk where he could see them. A reminder, a warning. He would call upon the solicitor. He would discover precisely how vulnerable she was. And then he would determine what a man who had nothing left to lose might yet be permitted to do. The solicitor's office was a narrow room on the village's principal street, cluttered with documents and the faint odor of old paper and tobacco. Mr. Weatherby was a thin man, with sharp spectacles, and the manner of one who had witnessed countless human compromises dissolve into legal testimony. "The matter is quite straightforward, Your Grace," Weatherby explained, spreading several documents across his desk. "The late Dr. Hartley's will is uncontested. His daughter is the sole beneficiary of his modest estate. However, there exists a mortgage against the property, taken out some 2 years previous, and the terms of that mortgage were structured in such a manner that the current financial circumstances render the obligation difficult to sustain." The Duke studied the documents. The handwriting was Catherine's. He recognized it from a single letter she had written to her father, which he had glimpsed years ago. The mortgage had been substantial, clearly taken at a time of desperation. "Who holds the mortgage?" he asked. "A moneylender from the neighboring county, a Mr. Gideon Sharp. He is, I must confess, not a man of excessive mercy. He has indicated that should the payments lapse, which given the young lady's circumstances seems increasingly likely, he intends to assume possession of the property and its contents." The Duke felt something crystallize within him, crystallize and then shatter. "And the young lady is aware of this?" Weatherby hesitated. "She has been apprised of the situation, sir. She has made inquiries regarding the possibility of employment that might generate sufficient income. I believe she has endeavored to secure a position as a governess, though her current circumstances have rendered such an arrangement complicated." Current circumstances: a child born outside wedlock, an unmarried woman living alone. Precisely the constellation of facts that would make her unemployable in polite society. "I see," the Duke said very quietly. "And if the mortgage were to be satisfied, the debt discharged entirely, what would be the legal outcome?" "She would retain possession of the property outright, Your Grace. It would provide her with security, and should she be cautious with expenditure, a modest sufficiency." The Duke rose from the chair and moved to the window. Outside, the village street was grey and quiet. A woman in a familiar grey shawl was walking with a child, the same woman, surely, that he had glimpsed yesterday. She was speaking to the child, pointing at something in a shop window. The child was not old enough to fully understand, but it tilted its small head and gazed in the direction she indicated. She must have been terrified. 2 years of what? Silence? Abandonment? The knowledge that she carried a child she could not acknowledge in a society that would destroy her reputation for the sin of loving him. "Mr. Weatherby," he said without turning from the window, "I wish to purchase the mortgage from Mr. Sharp. I wish to do so discreetly, and I wish for the deed to be transferred entirely to Miss Catherine Hartley. I further wish for the transaction to occur within the week." There was a profound silence. "Your Grace, if I may observe, such an action might be construed as unusual." "It will be construed as I wish it to be construed," the Duke said. "You are to manage this transaction with absolute discretion. The young lady is not to be informed of the precise nature of the intervention. She is simply to be notified that the mortgage has been acquired by a private benefactor who has chosen to forgive the debt as a charitable gesture toward her late father's memory." "A benefactor, sir?" "Anonymous," the Duke said coldly. "My name is not to appear in any document. Is that understood?" "Perfectly, Your Grace." The Duke turned from the window. The woman and child were no longer visible. They had moved beyond his line of sight, as perhaps they should have remained forever. Yet he had seen them. He could not unsee what he had witnessed, the tenderness in her posture, the trust in the child's movement toward whatever she had wished him to observe. That child wore no name that acknowledged his lineage. That woman bore no title, yet they possessed something that all his estates and rank could not purchase. Redemption, perhaps, or merely what redemption was permitted to look like when it came too late. "There is one more matter," the Duke said. "I wish to know the child's age precisely, and, if possible, any name by which the child is known." Weatherby removed his spectacles and polished them, a gesture of profound discomfort. "The child, sir, is approximately 18 months of age. As to the name, I believe the young lady calls him Henry, perhaps in honor of her late father's middle name. I could not say with certainty. Henry, a name that suggested no particular significance, no acknowledgement of the truth it contained, a name carefully chosen to draw no attention." The Duke nodded slowly. "Arrange the mortgage matter, Mr. Weatherby." "Immediately." He took his leave of the office and walked through the village streets with the measured pace of a man whose internal architecture had undergone a catastrophic reshaping. Each step felt weighted with consequence. Each breath seemed to contain the weight of 2 years' absence. He did not seek her out, not yet, but as he walked, he found himself passing the physician's cottage. The windows were bright with lamplight. Smoke rose from the chimney. Inside that small space, a woman was building a life from rubble he had created. He had given her nothing, not protection, not love, not even a farewell worthy of what she deserved. He had given her abandonment. And now, in the strange calculus of late redemption, he could only offer money and anonymity, the poor currency of a man too late to change anything except perhaps the trajectory of her suffering. The Duke returned to the manor house as twilight descended. He placed the worn gloves back upon his hands, feeling them conform to his fingers like a second skin, like memory itself made material. Tomorrow, he would begin the process of becoming a man capable of something more than pride. Tonight, he would sit in the darkness and confront the void his choices had created. 3 days had elapsed since the Duke's conversation with Mr. Weatherby, and the solicitor had proven himself a man of remarkable efficiency. The mortgage documents had been transferred, the debt discharged, and the deed to the physician's cottage had been formally re-registered. All of it accomplished with the discretion of a confession whispered in darkness. On the morning of the 4th day, Catherine received notification of the transaction. The letter bearing the solicitor's seal had been delivered to her door by a messenger boy who seemed uncertain whether to expect gratitude or suspicion. She stood in her modest sitting room, reading the words with the careful attention of one attempting to comprehend a dream that had somehow become material reality. "The mortgage against your father's property has been acquired by a private benefactor of considerable means, who has elected to forgive the debt in honor of your late father's medical service to this parish. The deed is hereby transferred to you in perpetuity." She read it 3 times. The words did not change. The legal reality they described, that she was suddenly solvent, that her home was secure, that the constant weight of financial catastrophe had been lifted, remained miraculous and incomprehensible. Henry was playing with a wooden horse upon the floor, the toy worn smooth by the hands of her own childhood. He was babbling in the manner of small children, constructing an elaborate narrative that only he could understand. She watched him with the peculiar intensity of a woman for whom security had become so fragile that she could not quite believe in its permanence. A knock came upon the door. Not the tentative knock of a messenger or tradesman, but something more deliberate, something that carried authority. She rose, smoothing her day dress. The blue wool she had worn 1,000 times, its color faded to the shade of winter sky. She opened the door to find a woman whom she recognized as the housekeeper from the ducal manor. Mrs. Thornton was a substantial woman in her 60s, with the bearing of someone accustomed to managing grand establishments. "Miss Hartley," Mrs. Thornton said, her voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone delivering a message she had been instructed to present without elaboration. "His Grace, the Duke of Ashford, requests the pleasure of your company at the Manor House this afternoon. Should you find it convenient, a carriage will call for you at 2 o'clock. Catherine felt the blood drain from her face with such violence that she had to place her hand upon the doorframe for support. The words seemed to arrive from an impossible distance, as though Mrs. Thornton were speaking from beneath deep water. There must be some misunderstanding," Catherine managed. "The Duke has no reason to—" "His Grace did not elaborate upon his reasons, Mrs. Thornton interrupted gently. "He merely expressed a desire to speak with you regarding certain matters pertaining to the village. He was most insistent that you should not feel any apprehension regarding the visit. It is a matter of business, nothing more." But business was precisely what Catherine feared. The Duke did not concern himself with village matters. He did not call upon unmarried women living alone. He could not, know what she carried in her heart every moment of every day, unless he knew. Unless somehow, in the way that terrible truths often find their way into the light, he had discovered the truth about Henry. "Please convey my regrets to His Grace," Catherine said, her voice barely audible. "I am not at liberty to accept such an invitation." Mrs. Thornton's expression shifted, acquiring a subtlety that suggested she understood far more than her formal words had indicated. "Miss Hartley, His Grace anticipated that you might decline. He requested that I convey a particular message should you do so. He said to tell you that the mortgage upon your property has been discharged by his own hand, and that he believed it might be more comfortable for you if you permitted him to explain his reasoning in person, rather than to hear of it through village gossip. He further said that he would consider it a personal favor if you would grant him a brief audience." The cottage seemed to tilt around Catherine. She gripped the doorframe more tightly. "The mortgage," she whispered. "Discharged and forgiven, miss, in full. Your property is yours, with no debt remaining. You are, if I may observe, precisely as secure as you ought to have been all along." Henry had ceased his play. He looked up at his mother with the perception that small children sometimes possess, sensing a disturbance in the emotional atmosphere he inhabited. He rose unsteadily to his feet and toddled toward Catherine, placing his small hand upon her skirt. She gathered him into her arms almost unconsciously, and Henry settled against her shoulder with the absolute trust of one who had never learned that trust could be betrayed. "Tell His Grace," Catherine said slowly, "that I shall attend at 2 o'clock, but I must bring my son. I will not leave him unattended." "His Grace anticipated that as well, miss. He instructed me to assure you that children are quite welcome at the Manor House. In fact, he expressed a particular interest in making the young gentleman's acquaintance." Catherine could not speak. She simply stood in the doorway with Henry against her breast, watching as Mrs. Thornton descended the garden path and returned to the waiting carriage. The housekeeper's expression, as she glanced backward once before departing, contained something that might have been sympathy. The remainder of the morning passed in a state of suspended horror. Catherine moved through her cottage, performing the ordinary tasks of existence, feeding Henry his breakfast of soft bread and milk, dressing him in his best wool coat, brushing his hair until it lay in gentle curls, but her mind was elsewhere, spinning through possibilities, catastrophes, and mercies she had never dared to anticipate. He knew. Somehow, he knew. And the mortgage, the impossible, miraculous discharge of the debt that had haunted her every waking moment, was the proof of that knowledge. No anonymous benefactor discharged debts of such magnitude. That had been him. That had been the Duke. At 1:30 the carriage arrived. Catherine lifted Henry onto her hip and stepped out into the grey afternoon. The village was quiet, but she was acutely aware of curtains shifting in windows, of the invisible eyes that tracked the progress of the physician's daughter toward the manor house. Let them watch. Let them construct whatever narratives they wished. She had nothing left to lose except the fragile dignity she had managed to preserve, and perhaps, she thought, holding Henry closer as the carriage wheels began to turn, dignity was precisely the thing she had never truly possessed at all. The manor house loomed before her, vast and grey, a monument to centuries of aristocratic authority. Catherine had been there only once before, years ago at a charity assembly, and even then she had remained at the periphery, a physician's daughter tolerated but not truly welcomed into the circles of consequence. Now she approached it as a supplicant, or perhaps as a ghost haunting the scene of her own abandonment. Mrs. Thornton met her in the entrance hall, a space so grand that Catherine's breathing seemed to disturb the still air. "His Grace is in the library, miss, if you will follow me." Henry had grown solemn, his small hands gripping Catherine's collar. The manor house was cold and echoing, nothing like the warm cottage to which he was accustomed. She felt him burrow more deeply into her shoulder, seeking reassurance she could not truthfully provide. The library doors were heavy oak, carved with the heraldic devices of the Duke's lineage. Mrs. Thornton knocked once, and then withdrew, leaving Catherine alone with her son and the terrible weight of the moment. The Duke was standing before the fireplace, his back to her. He wore the same dark coat he always wore, tailored to perfection, fitting him as precisely as the armor of his rank. When he turned, Catherine saw that his face had aged in the 2 years of her absence. There were lines around his eyes that she did not remember, a gravity in his expression that spoke of sleepless nights and internal struggle. "Miss Hartley," he said, and his voice was different too, stripped of the formal distance he had maintained in their acquaintance before. It was raw. It was broken. "Thank you for coming." Catherine could not speak. Henry, sensing her tension, began to fuss, a small whimper that broke the oppressive silence. "Please," the Duke continued, "do sit. You must be fatigued from the journey." He gestured toward a chair positioned near the fire. It was upholstered in rich blue damask, positioned with obvious deliberation to face toward where he stood. Catherine moved mechanically and sat, settling Henry upon her lap. The child was still frightened, but the warmth of the fire seemed to soothe him gradually. He ceased his protesting and gazed about the library with the wide-eyed wonder of one encountering grandeur for the first time. The Duke remained standing, his hands clasped before him. She noticed that he was not wearing his gloves, and the absence seemed significant somehow, as though he had deliberately divested himself of the armor that protected his identity. "I have discharged the mortgage against your father's property," he said without preamble. "There is no mystery to it, no anonymity to be maintained. It was I who arranged the matter. I wished you to be secure. I wished you to possess the thing that you should have been granted 2 years ago. Safety." Catherine's throat tightened. "Your Grace, I cannot accept such a gift. It is improper. It is improper?" Something flickered across his face. Pain, perhaps, or the ghost of bitter amusement. "Miss Hartley, propriety is a luxury we surrendered to the moment you departed this place carrying a child I did not acknowledge. There is nothing improper about securing the well-being of a woman He stopped. He turned away, his shoulders tightening visibly. "A woman for whom I bear responsibility." Henry reached out one small hand toward a leather-bound volume on the side table, his fingers grasping at the air. The Duke moved forward and placed the book gently into the child's palm. Henry examined it with solemn concentration, then offered it back to the Duke as though it were a gift of profound importance. The Duke accepted the book with the care one might show in handling something infinitely precious. For a moment he simply held it, his gaze fixed upon the child's small fingers still resting against the leather binding. "His name is Henry," Catherine said, the words emerging before she could construct an adequate defense against them. "Henry James Hartley. I named him for my father. She could not complete the sentence. She could not speak aloud what she had never been able to voice to anyone, that she had named her son after her father, because the Duke's given name, the name she might have wished to bestow upon her child as a final act of hidden rebellion, was forever impossible. "Henry," the Duke repeated softly. He lowered himself to one knee so that he was at the child's level. "A fine name, an honorable name." Henry, with the peculiar fearlessness of small children, reached out and touched the Duke's face, one small finger tracing the line of his jaw with innocent curiosity. The Duke remained motionless, allowing the contact, and Catherine saw something transform in his expression. It was as though he were seeing himself reflected in the child's eyes and recognizing for the first time a truth he had spent 2 years avoiding. "I have made inquiries regarding your circumstances," the Duke said, still at eye level with Henry, though his words were directed toward Catherine. "I am aware that you have encountered difficulties in securing employment. I am aware that you have faced questions regarding your respectability. I am aware of all the ways in which my absence has compounded your suffering." "You were not obligated to be present," Catherine said, though the words tasted of ashes. "I made choices. I accepted the consequences. Did you? The Duke rose and turned to face her fully. Or did I make choices that forced consequences upon you that you should never have been forced to endure? There is a distinction, Miss Hartley, and I have spent 2 years refusing to acknowledge it. Henry had grown drowsy in Catherine's lap, the warmth of the library and the emotional intensity of the moment combining to pull him toward sleep. His small head drooped against her shoulder. I have taken the liberty of instructing my steward to ensure that you are treated as the daughter of a respected physician and a woman of consequence in this parish, the Duke continued. Any questions regarding your son's paternity will be redirected. Any whispers regarding impropriety will be silenced by my explicit authority. Your reputation, Miss Hartley, will be restored because I have declared it so. Catherine felt something fracture within her, not painfully, but rather as though a structure she had been holding together through sheer force of will had finally been permitted to collapse. And what of my son? What am I to tell him when he is old enough to ask why the Duke of Ashford has taken an unprecedented interest in his well-being? What story shall I construct to explain your sudden intervention? The Duke was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was barely audible. That is a question I have not yet permitted myself to answer truthfully, but I believe, Miss Hartley, that we both know the answer lies in what I failed to do 2 years ago, in what I was too afraid, too proud, to become. He looked at Henry, sleeping now against his mother's shoulder, and Catherine saw in the Duke's expression something that broke her heart entirely. It was love. It was regret. It was the terrible knowledge that some truths once suppressed could never be fully acknowledged without destroying the careful structures of society. I will not abandon you again, the Duke said. In whatever capacity is permitted to me, I will ensure your security and your dignity. That much at least I can provide. The following week transformed Catherine's existence in ways both miraculous and deeply unsettling. The Duke's authority, wielded with subtle precision, began to reshape the village's perception of her status. Mrs. Thornton called with gifts, a bolt of fine wool, a set of china for Henry's meals, a leather journal bound in red morocco that Catherine could not imagine a purpose for, though she kept it nonetheless. Calls began arriving from the wives of substantial farmers and merchants. These were not the visits of friendship, but they were visits. Invitations to parish events that had previously been extended and then mysteriously withdrawn began to reappear. The vicar, previously cold in his acknowledgement of Catherine's presence at church, suddenly began directing pointed homilies toward the virtues of compassion and the dangers of hasty judgment. It was as though the Duke, without ever appearing in person to advocate for her, had quietly rearranged the entire moral landscape of Thornwick Parish. Catherine found herself increasingly uneasy. Protection, she was discovering, came with a peculiar cost. It created obligation, it created dependency, and more troublingly, it reopened possibilities that she had forced herself to abandon. On the 8th day after her visit to the manor house, the solicitor Mr. Weatherby called upon her. He was nervous, twisting his hat in his hands, and Catherine immediately perceived that he carried news of significance. "Miss Hartley," he began, "I come on behalf of His Grace with a proposal regarding your son's future. He has expressed a desire to establish a trust for the child's education and maintenance. The amount is quite substantial, sufficient to ensure that the boy might receive a proper schooling and eventually be positioned for respectable employment. His Grace has indicated that he would like the arrangement to be formalized through legal documentation." Catherine felt her throat constrict. "Mr. Weatherby, that is extraordinarily generous. But it is also quite impossible. Such an arrangement would raise questions that cannot be answered without acknowledging the child's paternity," Weatherby said gently. "Miss Hartley, if I may speak frankly, and if you will forgive an old solicitor for overstepping the boundaries of professional discretion, the Duke has already ensured that the village understands your son to be the legitimate child of a private arrangement. There is no shame in accepting provision for his well-being. Quite the contrary. It would be cruel to deny him advantages that his circumstances now permit." After Weatherby departed, Catherine sat for hours in her sitting room, watching Henry play with the wooden horse. The child was thriving. His cheeks had grown rosy, his clothing, thanks to the Duke's subtle provisions, had improved in quality. His world had expanded from the confines of a cottage threatened by financial ruin to something that approximated security. Yet security purchased at such a price felt like a cage constructed from silk. That afternoon, as the winter light was fading toward evening, Catherine made a decision. She dressed Henry in his warmest coat, wrapped him in a blanket, and walked to the manor house. She did not send word. She did not ask permission. She simply appeared at the servants' entrance and requested to speak with the Duke. She was shown to the library, the same room where their first meeting had occurred. This time the Duke was not standing before the fire. He was seated at his desk, surrounded by documents and ledgers. The machinery of his vast estate spread before him. When Catherine entered, he rose immediately, his expression shifting from concentration to something more guarded. "Miss Hartley, I did not expect— that is, I am pleased to see you. Please do sit." "I cannot accept the trust," Catherine said without preamble. She remained standing, Henry a solid weight in her arms. "I cannot permit my son to be provided for in a manner that creates an obligation I cannot repay. It is too much. It places me in a position of permanent indebtedness that I find intolerable." The Duke's face hardened slightly. "Your son is not a charity case, Miss Hartley. He is a child of considerable consequence, and he deserves every advantage that his circumstances permit. To refuse such provision on the grounds of personal pride seems to me a form of cruelty to the child." "And what of the truth?" Catherine demanded. "What am I to tell him when he is old enough to comprehend that a duke has taken an inexplicable interest in his welfare? What story shall I construct? That he is the bastard child of a man who abandoned his mother rather than sully his reputation? That his father chose pride and lineage over love?" The words hung in the air between them like an indictment. The Duke's face went pale, and he gripped the edge of his desk, as though it were the only thing preventing him from collapse. "I have spent 2 years," he said quietly, "attempting to construct a narrative that permits me to live with what I have done. You have just destroyed that narrative entirely by speaking the truth aloud in this room. For that, Miss Hartley, I am grateful. I am also devastated beyond measure." He moved from behind the desk and approached her slowly. Henry, perceiving a shift in the emotional tenor of the room, had begun to whimper. The Duke stopped at a distance that maintained propriety, though his eyes were fixed upon the child with an intensity that was almost unbearable to witness. "I cannot undo what I have done," he continued. "I cannot rewrite the past 2 years. I cannot give you or your son the life you should have had, but I can ensure that the future is different. I can ensure that he grows to manhood knowing his own worth, educated in virtue and consequence, secure in the knowledge that he is valued. That is not redemption, but it is something. It is all that I have left to offer." Catherine felt tears forming, hot and unwelcome. "And what of me? What am I to become while you construct this future for your son?" "That," the Duke said softly, "is a question I have not dared to answer, because to answer it would require me to acknowledge what I have known since the moment I glimpsed you in the village street, that I have lost more than my pride. I have lost the woman I was too afraid to love when I had the chance to do so." 2 weeks passed in a state of suspended tension. Catherine had not refused the trust. She had merely postponed her acceptance, requesting time to consider the implications. The Duke, respecting the boundary she had established, had retreated into a careful formality that was far more painful than his previous intervention had been. He did not call upon her. He did not send additional gifts. He simply existed in the background of her life, a constant presence rendered invisible by propriety. Yet everything had changed. The village had begun to whisper differently. Where once Catherine had been regarded as a fallen woman, she was now perceived as a widow, a fiction that had taken root with such swiftness that she sometimes wondered if anyone in Thornwick truly believed the lie, or if they had simply chosen to embrace a more comfortable narrative. Henry had begun to speak in simple words. "Mama, horse, up." His vocabulary was still limited, but each word represented a small victory, a confirmation that he was thriving despite the complexity of his circumstance. Catherine found herself watching him with the peculiar intensity of a woman, aware that the child she had raised in secret was beginning to enter a world where his origins might eventually be questioned. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, sealed with the Duke's own sigil, a design of elaborate complexity that Catherine had never before had cause to examine closely. Inside, the Duke's handwriting was careful and formal, as though he were composing a legal document rather than a personal communication. "Miss Hartley, the parish is hosting its annual assembly this coming Saturday. I have taken the liberty of arranging for the vicar to present a small reception beforehand, at which time I intend to make a formal statement regarding certain matters of consequence to this community. Your presence at this event would be invaluable." I am aware that I have no right to impose such a request upon you, and I entirely understand should you find yourself unable to attend. However, I must confess that I believe it is time for certain truths to be acknowledged, and I would prefer that you hear them from my own lips rather than through the inevitable distortion of village gossip. Yours in respectful service, Ashford Catherine read the letter 3 times, each reading generating new anxiety, a formal statement, a truth to be acknowledged. She understood immediately what the Duke was proposing, a public declaration of Henry's paternity. It would vindicate her. It would secure her son's future irreversibly. It would also destroy the Duke's reputation in a manner from which he might never fully recover. She spent the remainder of the day in a state of internal turmoil, holding the letter as though it might transmute into something different if she simply waited long enough. By evening, she had reached a decision that terrified her. She would attend. Saturday arrived with the grey clarity of late winter transitioning toward spring. Catherine dressed with meticulous care, selecting the blue wool dress that had been somewhat improved through the discreet gift of new ribbons and lace. She arranged her hair with precision, pinning it in a style that suggested respectability without attempting to claim sophistication. Henry was dressed in his finest clothes, a small wool suit that Mrs. Thornton had procured, complete with a waistcoat and collar that gave him the appearance of a diminutive gentleman. The vicar's reception was held in the parish hall, a modest stone building adjacent to the church. The space had been decorated with evergreen branches and candlelight, creating an atmosphere of solemn formality. Perhaps 20 families had gathered, representing the principal landholders and merchants of the parish. Catherine recognized many faces. Some had greeted her with cautious friendliness in recent weeks. Others still maintained the emotional distance of those uncertain whether to acknowledge her improved status. The Duke entered precisely at the appointed hour, dressed in formal evening wear of exceptional quality. He moved through the gathering with his usual authority, but Catherine perceived something different in his demeanor. There was a brittleness to his composure, as though he were maintaining control only through the most rigorous application of will. When he saw Catherine and Henry, he paused. For just a moment, the careful mask slipped, and she witnessed the raw emotion beneath. Then he composed himself and approached. "Miss Hartley," he said, extending his hand to her in greeting, "I am grateful that you have come. I trust your journey was not arduous." "It was pleasant, Your Grace," Catherine replied, placing her hand briefly in his. The contact was electric, a current of suppressed feeling passing between them in that instant of connection. The Duke turned his attention to Henry, who was regarding him with the solemn curiosity characteristic of young children. And this must be young Henry, a fine boy, a very fine boy indeed. The vicar, observing the interaction, appeared to sense that some significant event was about to unfold. He cleared his throat with the deliberate authority of one trained in ceremonial occasions and called the assembled company to attention. "Friends and neighbors," the vicar began, "His Grace has requested this gathering for the purpose of addressing a matter of consequence to this parish. I shall yield the floor to him with the understanding that what is spoken here today carries the weight of truth spoken before God and community." The assembled villagers shifted, exchanging glances. The Duke moved to the center of the room, and Catherine felt her heart accelerate with a violence that made her grip Henry more tightly. "I have asked you to gather here," the Duke began, his voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of profound emotion, "because I can no longer permit falsehoods to govern the affairs of those I have wronged. 2 years ago, I permitted a woman of exceptional virtue and character to depart this parish believing herself abandoned. I did so out of pride. I did so out of fear that my love for her would diminish my station or compromise my duty. I was wrong. I was profoundly, catastrophically wrong." The room had gone absolutely silent. Catherine could feel the weight of collective astonishment pressing against her from all directions. "This woman," the Duke continued, gesturing toward Catherine with a formality that transformed the gesture into something almost ceremonial, "is Catherine Hartley, daughter of our late physician. This child," he turned his attention to Henry, and his voice dropped into something that was barely audible, "is my son. He is Henry James Hartley, and he is the legitimate heir to my name and my estate, born in circumstances that I failed to acknowledge with the courage and honor that he deserved." There was a collective intake of breath. The vicar's expression suggested profound shock. "I am aware," the Duke continued, "that this revelation will generate discussion and judgment. I welcome both. I have no excuse to offer for the years I remained silent. I can only offer restitution." I am today formally establishing my son as heir to my titles and estates. I am further proposing marriage to Miss Catherine Hartley, pending her acceptance of such a proposal. I am aware that I have forfeited the right to expect such acceptance, but I am nonetheless compelled to offer it, because to do otherwise would be to permit my pride to continue its destructive work. He turned to Catherine, and in that moment, she saw not the distant aristocrat she had known, but a man stripped entirely of pretense, rendered vulnerable by the act of truth-telling. "Miss Hartley," he said, and his voice trembled slightly, "I cannot undo the pain I have caused you. I cannot restore the years you spent in isolation and fear, but I can spend the remainder of my life attempting to honor you as you deserve to be honored. Will you permit me to make that attempt?" Catherine was aware that she was trembling. She was aware that every person in the room was watching her, with expressions ranging from shock to disapproval to something that might have been compassion. She was aware that her entire life had transformed in the span of a few minutes, that the careful structures she had erected to survive her abandonment had been demolished by an act of public confession. She looked at Henry, who was watching the Duke with the innocent curiosity of one too young to comprehend the significance of what was occurring. Then she looked back at the man who had destroyed her, and, in destroying her, had forced her to become stronger than she would have otherwise been. "I will," she said softly. Then, gathering her courage, "I will, Your Grace, not because you have offered me security or restored my reputation, but because I perceive that you have finally discovered what I learned in the years of your absence, that love is not a threat to honor. It is the only thing that makes honor worth possessing." The announcement of the Duke's betrothal created a scandal of manageable proportions, the sort of scandal that in Victorian society could be transformed into romance through sufficient application of wealth and authority. Within a week, the engagement had become the principal topic of conversation in the parish, and within 2 weeks, invitations to the wedding had been extended to every family of consequence within 50 miles. Catherine found herself inhabiting a peculiar liminal space, no longer quite the fallen woman, but not yet fully the Duchess. She was fitted for a wedding dress of exceptional beauty, ivory silk with Honiton lace, designed by a modiste from London, whom the Duke had commissioned personally. The dress represented such a significant expenditure that Catherine felt almost guilty wearing it, as though by adorning herself in such luxury she was somehow endorsing the entire architecture of aristocratic excess. Yet as she stood before the mirror in the Duke's manor house, now to be her home, she barely recognized herself. The woman reflected in the glass was not the haunted creature who had spent 2 years building a life from desolation. She was someone new, someone the suffering had refined rather than destroyed. The Duke had been surprisingly thoughtful in his management of the engagement period. He had not pressed for intimacy beyond what propriety permitted. He had not attempted to consolidate his victory through the assertion of conjugal rights. Instead, he had spent considerable time in Catherine's company, and in those conversations, something unexpected had begun to unfold. They had begun to know each other, in the way that people who must share a life must eventually do. He had told her about his childhood, about the weight of expectation that had been placed upon him from infancy, about the way that duty had been constructed as the highest virtue while love had been relegated to the status of weakness. She had told him about the 2 years in the cottage, about the terror of raising a child alone, about the moments when she had believed that her life would forever be defined by abandonment. "I think," the Duke had said one afternoon, as they walked together through the manor's gardens, "that we both had been constructed as tragic figures, separated by circumstance and pride. But perhaps the true tragedy would have been never discovering that we might be reconstructed as something different." "And what is that?" Catherine had asked. "I'm not entirely certain," he had replied, "but I believe it involves learning to love without fear. For me, that is revolutionary." The night before the wedding, Catherine did not sleep. She sat in the guest chamber to which she had been assigned, watching the darkness gradually yield to the first light of dawn, holding Henry against her shoulder. The child had begun to comprehend, in his limited fashion, that something significant was occurring. He had asked repeatedly for Duke, the word that had become his familiar reference for the man who would become his father officially on this day. When Catherine finally rose and began to dress, she found herself in a state of emotional suspension. She was happy, genuinely, profoundly happy in a way that she had not believed possible, but she was also aware of what this happiness had cost, and of the ways in which her joy was built upon the foundation of others' judgment. The wedding took place in the parish church, the same building where she had attended services while living as an invisible woman in the community. The church was decorated with white flowers and early spring greenery. The Duke stood at the altar in mourning dress of exceptional elegance, and when Catherine entered, she saw his face transform with an emotion so raw that it made her breath catch. The ceremony itself was a conventional affair. The vicar performed the service with the solemnity appropriate to the union of a duke and a woman who had been, until very recently, beneath his station. But what made it extraordinary was the moment when the Duke placed the wedding ring upon Catherine's finger. "With this ring," he said, his voice carrying through the silence of the church, "I pledge not merely my title and my estate, but my understanding that you have been proven stronger than I have ever been. I pledge my admiration for the woman you have become, and I pledge my commitment to spend the remainder of my life attempting to become worthy of the love you have offered me." It was not the conventional vow. It was, in fact, remarkably unorthodox. But it was true, and Catherine perceived that in speaking truth before God and community, the Duke had finally discovered something that all his pride had previously obscured. After the ceremony, there was a wedding breakfast at the manor house. Henry, dressed in a miniature suit that matched the Duke's own attire, moved through the gathering with solemn dignity, occasionally accepting congratulations on the marriage of his parents with the unconscious grace of a child who had never known anything other than acceptance. Late in the evening, when the guests had begun to depart, Catherine found herself alone with the Duke in the library. It was the room where so much had transpired, where he had confessed his intervention in her financial matters, where he had acknowledged his love, where the architecture of their future had begun to take shape. "I have something for you," the Duke said. He withdrew from a leather case a document sealed with wax, the deep red of official authority. Catherine opened it carefully. It was a legal deed, transferring her father's cottage into her name outright, with a further clause establishing it as a charitable medical practice that would serve the poor of the parish in perpetuity, funded by the Duke's estate. At the bottom, in his handwriting, was a note, "For the woman who taught me that love is not weakness, but the truest form of strength." "I do not know how to accept such gifts," Catherine said, her voice trembling. "Then do not accept them," the Duke replied. "Permit me instead to offer them as the smallest possible recompense for the years I failed you. There is no gift grand enough for that, but I will spend my life attempting to find one." Spring arrived fully, transforming the moorland from grey and barren to something luminous with promise. The gardens of the manor house, which had been carefully maintained but formal, began to show evidence of Catherine's influence. She had introduced wildflowers among the formal beds, violets and irises, madresilva climbing the stone walls, creating a landscape that was both cultivated and wild, much like her own transformation from hidden woman to duchess. Henry had begun spending considerable time with the Duke. The child, sensing that this tall man represented some fundamental security, had latched onto him with the single-minded devotion of the very young. The Duke, in turn, had discovered in fatherhood a kind of redemption that no amount of charitable giving could have provided. He was learning to be present in ways that his own father had never been, to engage with the child not as an heir to be molded, but as a person to be known. Catherine observed these interactions with a complex mixture of joy and residual caution. The wounds of abandonment had healed sufficiently that she could permit herself to hope, but not so completely that she had forgotten the pain of those 2 years alone. She carried that memory as a kind of talisman, a reminder that happiness, when it came after suffering, required constant vigilance against the forces that might seek to destroy it again. One afternoon in May, as the light was turning golden and the air carried the sweetness of blooming flowers, Catherine was attending to her medicinal garden when she observed the Duke walking the perimeter of the grounds with one of the village elders, Mr. Croft, a man of considerable influence in the parish. She watched as the Duke gestured expansively, clearly proposing something to Mr. Croft. Even from a distance, she could perceive the energy in their interaction. Something definitive was being discussed. Later, when Henry had been put to bed and the servants had withdrawn for the evening, the Duke found Catherine in her sitting room. "I have made an announcement to the parish council," he said without preamble. "I intend to establish a school in your father's memory, a school where children of all stations will be educated in basic literacy, mathematics, and moral philosophy. I have endowed it permanently, with provisions for a master and mistress to be hired from among educated individuals who might otherwise lack opportunity. I have further stipulated that your father's cottage will serve as a clinic where medical services are provided to those who cannot afford to pay." Catherine felt tears forming. why are you telling me this?" "Because," the Duke said, sitting beside her and taking her hand, "I am finally beginning to understand what my pride had previously obscured, that the measure of a man is not in his titles or his estates, but in the legacy he leaves behind in the lives he touches. Your father built his legacy in the hearts of those he healed. You have built yours in the child we created together, and in the strength you displayed in raising him alone. I am attempting to build mine in the knowledge that I can still create something good despite the years I wasted in arrogance." He withdrew from his pocket a sealed letter, yellowed with age. "I found this in my father's papers after his death years ago. I have never shown it to anyone, but I believe you should read it." Catherine opened the letter with trembling fingers. The handwriting was the Duke's father's, a formal script that somehow conveyed a kind of desperation. "To whoever reads this, I have spent my life constructing a legacy of power and control, and in doing so, I have destroyed the only thing that might have made that legacy meaningful. My son will inherit my titles and my estates, but I fear he will inherit also my inability to love without fear. If he ever discovers the capacity to love fully, despite the risk, he will have achieved something I never could. I pray that he will not repeat my mistake." Catherine looked at the Duke, understanding flooding through her. "This was why you were so afraid." "Yes," he said quietly. "I was terrified that loving you would transform me into something my own father could not become, and yet simultaneously terrified that I lacked the courage to become that man. For 2 years I chose pride over truth, but in losing you, I finally found the capacity to choose differently." He reached for her hand and brought it to his lips. "I love you, Catherine. Not as a duchess, though I am honored you bear that title. I love you as the woman who stood alone and did not break. I love you as the mother who protected our son with a ferocity that shames my own previous failures. I love you as the person who has taught me that redemption, though it comes late, is not less valuable for its lateness." Catherine moved closer to him, and in the growing darkness of the evening, illuminated only by the firelight, she permitted herself to believe that perhaps the suffering had been transformed into something meaningful, not forgiven. She would never entirely forgive the years he had cost her, but integrated into a story that had culminated not in tragedy, but in something approaching grace. Outside, the spring wind carried the scent of flowers through the manor gardens. Inside, in the quiet of their shared space, the Duke and his Duchess sat together in silence, each contemplating the ways in which loss and love had become inextricably woven into the fabric of their becoming. Summer had settled upon the estate, with the full weight of its golden promise. 6 months had passed since the wedding, and the transformation of the manor house had become complete. Where once it had been a monument to austere formality, it had begun to acquire the qualities of an actual home. Catherine's influence was visible in every room, books arranged not by size but by preference, flowers in simple vases rather than formal arrangements, the sounds of a child's laughter echoing through corridors that had previously known only silence. Yet complications had begun to emerge, as complications inevitably do when the architecture of a life is reconstructed upon foundations that had previously been fractured. The cleric who had opposed Catherine so vehemently during her isolation had not accepted the transformation of his parish with grace. Reverend Blackwood, sensing his influence diminished by the Duke's public endorsement of Catherine's virtue, had begun to preach sermons of remarkable venom. They were ostensibly about the dangers of moral flexibility and the importance of maintaining rigid standards, but the subtext was transparent to anyone possessed of even modest perception. Catherine had largely ignored these pronouncements, but the Duke had not. She observed his increasing tension, the way his jaw would tighten when reports of Blackwood's sermons reached his ears, the manner in which he had begun to investigate the cleric's financial arrangements with the intensity of a prosecutor building a case. "He is deliberately undermining what we have attempted to accomplish," the Duke said one evening, his voice sharp with frustration. "He is telling the parish that our marriage is a corruption of sacred principles, that Henry is a bastard, adorned in false legitimacy, that you are a woman who has seduced a duke into abandoning his duty." "Let him speak," Catherine replied calmly, though her own anger was considerable. "Words have only the power we grant them." "Easy for you to say," the Duke responded, "when you are no longer vulnerable to those words. But there are women in this parish who are vulnerable. There are children born outside the structures that Blackwood insists are essential. By refusing to confront his hypocrisy, we permit him to continue destroying lives." It was this conversation that precipitated what became known, in parish history, as The Reckoning. The Duke, having discovered through discreet investigation that Reverend Blackwood had fathered a child with a serving woman years previous and had then systematically abandoned both mother and child, had compiled documentation of sufficient specificity to constitute irrefutable proof. The confrontation occurred at the annual parish gathering held in the Great Hall of the Manor House. It was meant to be a celebration of the completion of the new school, a moment of communal pride in the accomplishment of the Duke's charitable vision. Instead, it became a reckoning. The Duke rose to speak after the formal ceremonies had concluded. He did not shout. He did not display rage. Instead, he spoke with the measured precision of one presenting evidence in a tribunal. "I have discovered," he said, his voice carrying through the silent hall, "that there exists among us a man of considerable moral authority who has erected a legacy of judgment upon a foundation of extraordinary hypocrisy. This man has condemned women for the precise circumstance in which he himself has placed them. He has demanded standards of virtue that he himself violates with apparent impunity." The assembled company stirred, perceiving that something significant was occurring. The Duke gestured, and his solicitor stepped forward with a sheaf of documents. "Reverend Blackwood fathered a child with a woman named Margaret Thorne some 15 years past. He subsequently abandoned both mother and child, forbidding the woman to speak of the relationship or to seek maintenance from him. This child, now a boy of considerable years, has grown to manhood without knowledge of his paternity, while his father has prospered in his position of moral authority." Reverend Blackwood had risen to his feet, his face suffused with color. "Your Grace, this is a matter of private circumstance. It is entirely inappropriate." "What is inappropriate," the Duke interrupted with cold precision, "is the authority you have wielded to harm innocent women while maintaining the protection of your own reputation. I have provided Margaret Thorne with a position as head of housekeeping in my own staff, with a substantial salary, and the security she should have been granted 15 years ago. I have further ensured that her son is apprenticed to a craftsman of considerable skill, positioned to build a respectable future. And I have made it explicitly clear to the parish council that your position as cleric is no longer tenable." The silence that followed was absolute. Then, with the movement of a single organism, the parish council members rose in acknowledgement of the Duke's judgment. "I have learned something in recent months," the Duke continued, addressing the assembly rather than the now demolished cleric. "I have learned that moral authority is not conferred by position or by the appearance of virtue. It is earned through the courage to acknowledge one's own failures and to act with genuine compassion rather than concealed judgment. I am aware that my own moral ledger is not spotless. I have done profound harm, but I have attempted to acknowledge that harm and to make restitution. I will tolerate no less from those who presume to instruct others in the ways of virtue." Catherine watched from her place with Henry, and she saw in this moment something that transformed her understanding of the man she had married. He was not perfect. He would never be perfect. But he had discovered something more valuable than perfection. He had learned to act with integrity, even in the face of his own compromises. When the assembly dispersed, there was a quality of closure to the proceedings, not the closure of resolution, but the closure of a difficult chapter being acknowledged and sealed away. Reverend Blackwood departed the parish within the fortnight, and his replacement, a younger cleric of genuine compassion, arrived before summer's end. That evening, Catherine found the Duke in the library, sitting before the fire with 2 glasses of wine. "You have made an enemy," she said, accepting the glass he offered. "Blackwood will not forgive this." "I am aware," the Duke replied, "but I have also ensured that his hypocrisy will not continue to poison this community. Sometimes, Catherine, protecting what we love requires confronting what threatens it, even when confrontation is costly." She sat beside him, and they sat in companionable silence as the fire burned lower and the night deepened around them. Autumn arrived with a clarity that seemed almost deliberately metaphorical. The leaves turned the colors of precious metals, gold, copper, bronze, as though nature itself were adorning the landscape with symbols of transformation. 18 months had passed since the Duke's public declaration of Henry's paternity, and the child had begun to develop the precocious awareness characteristic of children who have witnessed profound change. "Papa," Henry said one afternoon, using the word that had become second nature to him, "why did people say Mama was bad?" The Duke was teaching Henry to ride, a diminutive pony having been procured for this purpose. He paused, considering how to answer a question that contained within it all the complexity of social judgment and moral ambiguity. Because people sometimes mistake circumstance for character, the Duke said carefully. Your mother was not bad. She was strong, but strength in women is not always recognized as such. Sometimes it is mistaken for transgression, simply because it exists outside of what people have learned to expect. Henry absorbed this, his small face serious. But you know she is good. Yes, the Duke said. I know it absolutely. Then that is what matters, Henry concluded with the moral certainty of childhood. The Duke exchanged a glance with Catherine, who was watching from beneath the shelter of a spreading oak. In that look, there passed a recognition of how profoundly a child's innocence could illuminate what adults had obscured through their careful constructions of judgment. The school that had been established in Dr. Hartley's memory was thriving. It had attracted students from across the parish, children of labourers and merchants and tenant farmers, all receiving instruction in fundamentals that would provide them with capacity for advancement. Catherine had become involved in its governance, and her presence, authoritative but not imperious, knowledgeable but not condescending, had become central to its functioning. The medical clinic, similarly, had become a beacon of hope for those who could not afford the services of conventional practitioners. The Duke had recruited a young physician, a man of evident skill and genuine compassion, and together with Catherine, they had created a space where suffering could be attended to without the burden of shame. I have been thinking, the Duke said one evening, as they prepared for bed, about the future. Not merely our future, though that seems increasingly certain, but the future of this estate, of our son, of the work we have begun. And what have you concluded? Catherine asked, already sensing that he was constructing something significant in his mind. That I wish to formalize what we have accomplished as a kind of legacy. I have instructed my solicitor to establish a permanent foundation, the Hartley-Ashford Foundation for the Advancement of Virtue through Education and Medical Mercy. It will be funded in perpetuity, governed by principles of compassion rather than charity. The distinction is important. Charity implies inferiority. What we have created implies mutual responsibility. Catherine felt something shift within her, a recognition that they had not merely rebuilt their individual lives, but had created something that transcended personal redemption. They had created institutions. They had created lasting structures of grace. And Henry? She asked. What will you teach him about his position in all of this? That inheritance is not merely a matter of titles and estates, the Duke replied. It is a matter of understanding that those to whom much has been given bear responsibility for those to whom little has been granted. I was taught that privilege was a right. I'm attempting to teach him that it is an obligation. Catherine moved closer to her husband, and in the darkness of their chamber, surrounded by the comfortable furnishings of the life they had built together, she permitted herself to acknowledge the profound gratitude she carried. Not gratitude for the suffering. She would never be grateful for that. But gratitude for the way that suffering had been transformed, integrated, alchemized into something that served a purpose beyond mere personal happiness. I love you, she said simply. And I love you, the Duke replied, drawing her close, though I fear my love can never be adequate recompense for the years I cost you. Then spend your life attempting to be adequate, Catherine said. That is all anyone can do. 10 years later, the gardens of Ashford Manor had become renowned throughout the county for their unusual character, a careful balance of formal precision and wild abundance that seemed to reflect the very essence of the life that had been cultivated within them. The violets and irises that Catherine had introduced all those years ago had proliferated, creating drifts of colour throughout the spring. Madresilva climbed the stone walls with such exuberance that it threatened to overwhelm them entirely, and Catherine permitted it to flourish unchecked, finding in its abundance a metaphor for the overflow of grace that seemed to characterize their existence. The Duke stood at the window of his study, watching as his son, now a boy of 12, possessed of the serious demeanor characteristic of one who understood his responsibilities, accompanied his mother through the gardens. Henry was holding Catherine's hand, but there was a quality of partnership in the gesture rather than dependency. He had grown into a child of considerable grace, educated in both classical subjects and moral philosophy, prepared to inherit not merely titles, but the burden of conscience that the Duke had come to understand was the truest aristocracy. Much had transpired in the decade since that winter afternoon, when the Duke had glimpsed a woman in a grey shawl on the village street. The school had expanded, now educating more than 100 children of various stations. The medical clinic had become a model that had attracted the attention of progressive practitioners from London, resulting in a visiting physician program that had brought knowledge and innovation to the rural parish. Most remarkably, the foundation established in Catherine's father's name had begun to extend its work beyond the immediate parish, funding educational initiatives and medical services across 3 counties. Yet the greatest transformation had not been institutional. It had been deeply, profoundly personal. The marriage that had begun in scandal and public declaration had become something that the Duke found himself unable to adequately describe. It was not the passionate romance of novels, though there was passion in their connection. It was something more durable and more sustaining. It was the partnership of 2 people who had been forged in fire and had emerged not merely intact, but transformed. Catherine had blossomed into her role as Duchess, with a grace that surprised even those who had witnessed her earlier struggles. She had not attempted to become someone other than herself. She had simply become more fully herself, unencumbered by the shame that had previously constrained her. She was known in the parish as a woman of genuine wisdom, as someone who could be consulted on matters ranging from medical ethics to the proper conduct of charitable enterprises. More importantly, she was known as someone who had transcended her circumstances, not through the patronage of a powerful man, but through the exercise of her own considerable faculties. The Duke had changed as well. The rigid formality that had once governed his interactions had softened considerably. He was now known as a man of principle, certainly, but also as a man capable of genuine warmth, of visible affection for those under his authority, of the kind of humility that came from acknowledging past failures. Henry, in particular, had become the conduit through which the Duke's transformation was made visible. The boy was being raised with an understanding that his position in society was not a matter of inherent superiority, but of accumulated privilege and consequent responsibility. He was being educated alongside children of labourers and merchants, a deliberate choice that Catherine had insisted upon. He was learning trades alongside his classical education, becoming familiar with the work of actual human hands rather than merely the abstractions of aristocratic authority. "Papa wishes to speak with you," Catherine said one afternoon, finding the Duke in his study. "Henry has asked a question that he believes only you can adequately answer." The Duke followed her to the gardens, where Henry was waiting with the solemn expression he adopted when confronted with matters of genuine significance. "Father," Henry said, "Mother has been explaining to me about the years before you married. She has told me that I was born while you were not yet my papa, and that this was a difficult circumstance. I wish to understand why. I wish to understand what made it so important that you not acknowledge me for so long." The Duke felt something lodge in his chest, not pain precisely, but the weight of honest reckoning. He sat upon the garden bench and gestured for his son to join him. "When you were born," the Duke began, "I was a different man than I am now. I was a man who believed that my station in society was more important than my connections to other human beings. I was a man who feared that loving your mother openly would diminish me, would make me seem weak in the eyes of those whose respect I had cultivated." "Were you weak?" Henry asked with the directness of childhood. "Yes," the Duke said. "I was weak in precisely the way that matters most. I lacked the courage to love fully. It took losing your mother and living without her for 2 years to teach me that real strength consists not of the power to command, but of the willingness to be vulnerable in love." Henry considered this with the gravity characteristic of his age. "And do you regret the years you did not know me?" "Every day," the Duke said. "But I have learned that regret, if it motivates compassion and change, is not merely a waste of time. It is a kind of education. I regret the pain I caused your mother, and I will spend the remainder of my life attempting to ensure that she knows she was worth every sacrifice I might have made, and more besides." "I think," Henry said, with the kind of moral clarity that sometimes emerges from youth, "that you have already done that." "She seems happy." "She does, doesn't she?" the Duke agreed. That evening, as Catherine prepared for bed, the Duke found her brushing her hair, a ritual that had become a kind of sacred space between them. He watched for a moment, then approached and took the brush from her hands, continuing the task himself. "Henry asked me today why I did not acknowledge him immediately," the Duke said. "I told him the truth, that I was not strong enough to love as I should have loved." Catherine closed her eyes, permitting him to complete the brushing. "And what did he say?" "That I have already atoned, that you seem happy." Catherine turned to face him, and in her expression, the Duke saw the entire trajectory of their shared history, the pain and the redemption, the loss and the recovery, the wilderness and the eventual emergence into grace. "I am happy," Catherine said, "not because of what you have given me, though your generosity has been extraordinary, but because you have finally learned what I learned in those 2 years alone, that happiness is not a destination achieved through the accumulation of security or status. It is a daily choice to engage with life fully, to love without reservation, to permit oneself to be transformed by the people one encounters." The Duke drew her close, and they stood together at the window, looking out over the gardens that had become a symbol of their life together, wild and cultivated, structured and abundant, orderly and overflowing simultaneously. 10 years had passed since that winter afternoon, yet in many ways time had ceased to operate in the conventional manner. The years had not erased the past. The wound of abandonment remained, a scar that Catherine carried with a kind of quiet dignity. But the years had transformed that wound into something purposeful. It had become the source of her wisdom. It had become the foundation upon which she had built her conviction that suffering, when acknowledged and integrated, could serve as a teacher more valuable than any amount of privilege. The Duke, similarly, carried with him the knowledge of what his pride had cost. It was a weight he bore gratefully, for it kept him perpetually aware of the person he might become, should he permit himself to slip back into the comfortable certainties of aristocratic privilege. Henry, sleeping in his chamber upstairs, carried neither the wound nor the explicit memory of the struggle that had brought him into existence, but he carried something perhaps more valuable. He carried the lived example of a man and woman who had transcended their circumstances through the power of honest confrontation and genuine love. He would, in time, inherit titles and estates and position, but he had been given something far more valuable. He had been given a paradigm of what human connection might look like when stripped of pretense and fear. As the night deepened, and the manor house settled into silence, the Duke and Duchess stood together in their chamber, and there was nothing left to say. The words had been spoken and proven through action. The apologies had been made and accepted. The transformation had been completed. What remained was simply the daily work of love, the small gestures of kindness, the conversations that deepened with each passing year, the commitment to becoming each day more fully human, more fully generous, more fully alive. The windows of Ashford Manor glowed softly in the darkness, a beacon of warmth in the English night. Inside, a family, bound not by uncomplicated happiness, but by the durable love that emerges from genuine understanding, moved toward their rest. And in the gardens below, the flowers bloomed in darkness, and the madresilva grew wild and free, a living monument to the belief that even in the most constrained circumstances, beauty and abundance might still flourish if given sufficient permission and care. The Duke, having finally learned to love, had also learned to hope, and in that hope lay the seed of redemption for all of them. The moral of the story, a profound reflection. 2 years after she left, the Duke found her with child and realized he'd lost more than his pride. In this story lies a truth that echoes through the corridors of human experience. The greatest loss we can suffer is not the loss of position, wealth, or status, but the loss of our capacity to love fully and without fear. The Duke's journey teaches us that pride, while often mistaken for strength, is in fact the armor we construct when we are too afraid to be vulnerable. He wore the mask of duty, of aristocratic obligation, of the necessity of maintaining station. Yet beneath these justifications lay a simpler, darker truth. He was afraid that to love Catherine openly would diminish him in the eyes of a world that had taught him to measure his worth by the respect he commanded, rather than by the love he gave. Catherine's journey teaches us something equally essential, that survival, true survival, is not merely the continuation of biological existence. It is the maintenance of dignity and hope, even when the world has conspired to deny you both. She built a life from desolation. She raised a child alone, and in doing so she preserved something precious, the capacity to trust even after trust had been shattered. The story asks us to consider what it means to measure value. In a world that systematized Catherine's shame, that weaponized her vulnerability, that threatened to destroy her son's legitimacy through the mere fact of her love, what constituted courage? It was not the courage to declare her pain openly. Society would have destroyed her for such transparency. It was the quieter, more profound courage to continue living with grace, to continue loving despite abandonment, to continue hoping despite circumstance. And when the Duke finally returned, what was it that redeemed him? It was not the power of his position. It was not the weight of his authority. It was his willingness to acknowledge that he had been wrong. It was his acceptance that redemption could not be purchased, but only earned through the patient work of becoming different. The deepest lesson of their story is this: love without fear is not the privilege of the noble or the educated or the elevated. It is a choice available to every human being, and the cost of refusing that choice, the cost of permitting pride and fear to govern our actions, is measured not merely in the temporary consequences of separation, but in the permanent diminishment of our own humanity. The gardens that Catherine cultivated after her suffering bloomed not because the soil was rich, but because she tended them with care, despite their initial barrenness. The children educated in the school named for her father learned not merely academic subjects, but the revolutionary notion that their circumstances were not their destiny. The women who found refuge in the clinic discovered that they could be healed without shame. All of these transformations were possible because one man finally learned to love more than he feared, and one woman learned that survival could be transformed into dignity, and one child grew to understand that his entire existence was a testimony to the power of love to persist against circumstance. The story does not tell us that love will always arrive in time. It does not promise that suffering will be redeemed. It does not suggest that redemption, when it comes, will be uncomplicated or painless. But it tells us something perhaps more valuable, that even in the depths of our failures, even after we have committed acts of devastating pride, even when we have abandoned those we should have cherished, there remains a possibility of transformation. That possibility does not erase the past. It does not eliminate the scars. But it offers something that human beings need as much as we need food and air. It offers the chance to become more than we have been, to love more fully than we feared possible, and to build legacies that transcend our own small lives. This is the true aristocracy, not the accident of birth, but the daily choice to love without the armor of pride. Dear beloved viewers, the Duke and Catherine's story of redemption, sacrifice, and transformative love has now unfolded before you in its full complexity and beauty. But their journey does not end here. It continues in the hearts and minds of everyone who has witnessed their struggle and triumph. We invite you to join our community of storytellers and dreamers. If this narrative has moved you, if you have found yourself reflecting upon the nature of pride, love, and redemption in your own life, we ask you to subscribe to our channel. Each week we bring you new stories of Victorian romance, tales of women who overcome impossible circumstances, of men who learn that true strength lies in vulnerability, of love that persists against the weight of social judgment. Leave us a comment below. Tell us, what did this story mean to you? Which moment resonated most deeply? Have you ever experienced the transformative power of love after great loss? What did you learn about courage, dignity, and redemption from the Duke and Catherine's journey? Your comments, your thoughts, your engagement, these are the threads that weave our community together. They remind us why we tell these stories. They connect you to thousands of others who believe that love is not weakness, that vulnerability is not shame, and that transformation is always possible. Share this story with someone you love. Send it to a friend who needs to remember their own strength. Share it with someone who has forgotten that their circumstances do not define their destiny. Together, we are building a world where stories of genuine connection and authentic love are honored, where the complexity of human emotion is explored with tenderness and depth, where redemption is understood not as a destination, but as a daily practice. Thank you for being part of our Victorian Love Stories family. With profound gratitude and deepest appreciation, the Victorian Romance Audio Stories team. We create stories that remind us of our capacity for love, courage, and transformation. We believe that in a world that often demands perfection, there is profound beauty in the messy, complicated, glorious reality of human connection. Thank you for allowing us to be part of your journey.